That's like a really cool and interesting way to view it, and it does make sense. And yeah, I think a lot of what we're dealing with are archetypes, archetypes and even entities that we come across. We don't understand them, but they seem to be coming from a realm that's not, foreseeable here. And that's something that I've dealt with in my personal life, and I don't get into that in my work, but it is something that I'm heavily fascinated with. Like I listened to your podcast with The Exorcist. I'm fascinated by stuff like that, and I've tried to kind of understand what these things are through psychology and through scripture and different things. And what I'm starting to realize, at least for myself, is that there is, there's a realm of the collective subconscious, as Carl Jung would have put it, and archetypes, images, and names. These are just little fancy ways for the mind to understand the spirit realm or the subconscious realm. So for your download to say that these are just, a Lucifer, a Satan, it's kind of like saying don't get too wrapped up into these ideas. They're archetypes, but the energy behind these archetypes is real, and it is forming, and it could have stemmed off from an original entity, Samael. And historically speaking, it's interesting too, because all this stuff about devils and Lucifers, it all stems from the idea of the fallen angels. And the book of Enoch is probably the only biblical scripture that we have that tells us a detailed story about that. And according to the book of Enoch, there were angels, and some of these angels decided to break off, and among them were Azazel and Samael. And then so from there, the schism occurred of all these fallen angels. So without the original fallen angels breaking off and doing what they did, even just theologically or conceptually speaking, there would be no devils or Lucifers.
Hey, yo, welcome to the Godcast.
The Lord told me to tell you, wake up, wake up, wake up.
You want answers?
I think I'm entitled.
You want answers?
I want the truth!
Was there an awakening moment?
So this is like an all-encompassing awakening.
It's all-encompassing.
Every day, as they would creep in, I would just have to stop and catch myself right in those moments and say, God, I trust you. I'm not going to be afraid. I'm giving you my fear.
And I also came to the understanding what you're saying, what you can't have light without dark. But then I started having the thought of, well, if we didn't have nighttime and we didn't have the winter, then plants would never stop growing. So if we never had issues, then we would only grow more. The thing with me, I never got into the astrology stuff. I never got into really doing any kind of energy work until I was very firm with Jesus. And it's a thing with me and Jesus where like people are praying and I'll get the sudden urge to tell that person to give your burdens to Jesus, and they'll say like, oh, I was just trying to talk to Jesus.
Welcome to Godcast,
the Goodness Over Darkness podcast.
Here's your host, Emmanuel Kingman.
What is going on, everybody? Welcome to Godcast, the Goodness Over Darkness podcast. I'm your host, Emmanuel Kingman, and here with me is the light bringer, Mimi.
Hello.
Hello, my lightest.
Was that light
lady.
enough?
It was pretty heavy, actually.
Sorry.
So on today's episode, we had on special guest Esoteric Eddie. And Eddie is author of the book Lucifer Mysteries Revealed. And he has a YouTube channel called Esoteric Eddie TV. And he does a lot of different stuff about the esoteric side of life, the mystical part of life, the what's the word I'm looking for? The metaphysical part of life, if you will. And he has done a lot of research. So he's fairly young. He's 27, and he's written 2 books now. Mm-hmm. And his first book, you can't purchase it right now, but he's revamping it to get it released in the summertime.
The Anunnaki theorem.
Yeah, the Anunnaki theorem. So
I know
that'll.
you're going to be interested in that.
Yeah, so we'll have to definitely talk about that at some point as well. And we kind of breezed into a little bit because I feel that the Anunnaki story is really comes from or with the Book of Enoch, that it's somehow in conjunction with one another. So I think that we kind of breezed into that just a bit because in this episode, not only do we cover Lucifer, Satan, the devil, and he gives his very detailed research into these different things and where they come from. I mean, he really breaks down the name Lucifer and how it was a mistranslation. I give my little quote unquote download that I received from God while listening
Which
to
is also,
Esoteric Eddie. What?
Which is also the same sort of as a mistranslated words.
Well, it was kind of that that's how we know him as that name Lucifer. Sure. That's how we know. It wasn't saying
we
that
kind of personified the word by giving it a capital letter, but that's not how the origin.
Yeah, but my download, it was just kind of how we know him as that name. It wasn't explaining anything like that name meant anything, just as how I would know him as. So that's an interesting thing, and I've said it before, so you might have heard me have said that before. We talk about that, then we get into the Book of Enoch just a little bit. We talk about for a good while we kind of are bordering on the Book of Enoch with the rest of our discussion, which was Ethiopia, and how important Ethiopia actually is to not just the world, but also, at this time, but also how Enoch is probably from Ethiopia.
Right, a history.
Yeah,
a bit.
It's a Christian nation. It was a Jewish nation and then became a Christian nation because Jesus fulfilled all the prophecy that they were learning in the Torah. And we get into King Solomon and Queen Sheba having a child together. And Queen Sheba from Ethiopia went back to Ethiopia after visiting King Solomon, brought back all of his teachings and his seed, and then had a child herself. And we get into how Ethiopia fended itself off from what should have been countries that would have been able to take over, that they should have been out manpowered, and they weren't.
Italy and Egypt.
Yeah, it's a very fascinating thing, and it was in the 1800s, which, if that is, the place that we think it is, and the Bible talks about that it would be surrounded, but it wouldn't be conquered. Well, Ethiopia was surrounded, but it wasn't conquered. So, I mean, it kind of goes hand in hand with that as well. Ethiopia is just a very magical place. They use a different calendar, and
that's the strangest thing.
I break down that towards the end there, and Mimi kind of poo-poos me before I even say what I'm going to say, and then changes her mind right after I finish.
Well, I had to finish.
She
I
judged
had to
the
let
book
you
before
finish.
its cover. Yeah, exactly. So if you guys aren't familiar with the calendar that Ethiopia uses, it's very different than not
it's
too
the
different, but it's
thing to
different
think that
than ours.
2014 in Ethiopia right now. It's
yeah.
I can't even.
Yeah, it's about what 4, 5, almost 6 months into the year 2014 in Ethiopia.
So weird.
Well, yeah, they're 8 years behind us. Well, it's 7.5 years behind us. Which, why is that? I don't know. I don't know the answer to that. But they use a calendar that was Enoch's calendar, essentially. So in the Book of Enoch, and this gets into. So I'll just say this part right here because I didn't mention in the episode. When we talk about the past, how only 360 days were kept, it's not really true that 360 days were kept. 360 days were numbered, but there were also days that were only named.
Observed. Yeah.
Well, yeah, they had names. So if you write out your calendar 1 to 30, and you had an equinox or a solstice in there, that isn't counted in the numbered days. That's just a named day. So the 4 named days would have been the solstices and the equinoxes as we know them. So they wouldn't have been counted in the named days. And then the 365th day would have been the day of the reckoning, which would be New Year's, what we call New Year's. Not that day, because that day is perverted for Janus or Janus, whereas the day of the reckoning of the Lord would be like if you were on a circle, on a cycle, on a record, and you got to the end point, and then you had to rewind it back to the beginning. That's the day of the reckoning. That would be the end point. So it gets reckoned. Everything gets changed back to how it was. Uh, and that would be the 365th day. And we would call that Sunday. Because it's the sun's day, and it would be a day of the reckoning of the Lord would be one every year, whereas the moon or Monday, the moon day, the moon will get one every 4 years because there's 4 faces to the moon or 4 phases to the moon. So it would only happen once every 4 years, and then we get a 366th day, which would be Monday or Moon Day. So that last little bit is my take on it, but that is generally how the book of Enoch's calendar, or Enoch's calendar, not the book of Enoch, but Enoch's calendar was 360 number days, 4 name days, and then the day of the reckoning. So people talk about that, oh, there's only 360 days, is what they kept back in the day. That's just not true. There wasn't 360 days. There were 360 numbered days. It's a difference. When you number it, then name it, it's a difference to it. So the Ethiopian calendar, they have 12 months of 30 days, and then they have their 13th month has 5 days in it, which that's not really how it was kept, but it's kept separately like that because they know it's supposed to be kept separate, but it's still not exact of what they were doing back in the day. So it's just interesting, just very interesting stuff. Is there anything else that we wanted to cover in the intro here?
We talked a little bit about the Ark of the Covenant.
Mm-hmm.
We talked about a lot of things.
Yeah, the Bible, a lot of different pantheons.
Pegum is the 13th month in Ethiopia.
Okay, Pegum
comes from the Greek word, which means days forgotten when a year is calculated.
Oh,
interesting.
Yeah, because it's
it
not
has
calculated.
5 days or 6 days in a leap year.
Right. Exactly. How I was saying, it's because they're not calculated, because they're not numbered. They're just named. So they're without a number. And why is that? Well, I can't answer that for you, but when we have 360 degrees in a circle, that's you have 360 degrees. So you would think that that's the completion, but it's a weird thing. When we talk about the book of Enoch, there are different beings that are in charge of moving the sun and the moon and the stars. There's different beings that are in charge of it, and they get their own day. That's what the equinoxes and solstices are for, is recognizing the beings that are moving the sun and the moon. So the sun has the 4 different named beings, or it has 2. So I forget what it is at the moment. I'm trying to do this off the top of my head. But Tomas is one of the beings that moves the sun. Thomas, which is a biblical name. You guys got to look into the Book of Enoch. You can check out my series on it if you're not familiar with it. It's a 3-part series. They're each about an hour long. And I think the most significant part of that series is the 3rd part. I spent 45 minutes talking about the Son of Man references, which is long before the Bible was put together. So go check that out if you're not familiar with it, and read the Book of Enoch for yourself. But also check out all of Esoteric Eddie's stuff. He does a lot of great breakdowns on his YouTube channel. You can find him as a guest on several different podcasts like The Great Deception and Rising from the Ashes. He has some great appearances on there. And go check out his book, The Lucifer Mystery Revealed. He spent a great deal of time writing and researching this. You can tell that this young man knows what he's talking about. He has a lot of information just right off the top of his head. He just was going all throughout, and it was amazing. So I think you guys will really, really enjoy this episode. You got anything else for us, Mimi?
Nope. Just got to get on. I'm the research committee, so I have a little bit more research to do before the next show.
All right. So make sure you go check out my website, emmanuelkingman.com, IMMANUEL Kingman.com. Make sure you guys, if you want to be part of my Bible study, that you send me an email. Please send me the email, because the DMs, I'm going to lose track of it. I'm going to just send out an email with the Zoom link so that I can include everybody in it, and everyone will just get the link. Send me that email with the subject Bible study. That'll be starting in March, and I'll be putting the video up on my website, as only paid members of my website will be able to access it, but I will be putting that there. And it'll be a great time. I'm looking forward to it. I encourage everyone to bring their own Bible, their own interpretation. It doesn't matter what your belief system is. It doesn't matter what your understanding of the Bible is. I want different people there who are very different. I want this to be a coming together of the minds of many different experience levels, of different knowledge levels, of different understandings. I really want to bring this together. So send me that email, please. And you can find all my social media, all my YouTube, Goodness Over Darkness. You can find out all that on my website, emmanuelkingman.com. So that'll do it. And after the bridge will be the interview with Esoteric Eddie. So everybody stay tuned for that. And we will...
Welcome to the Godcast. All right.
And we will see you later. Bye.
Welcome to the Godcast. Cross up on my back, I'm slaying demons. It don't matter what you call that. Searching for the truth, facts are facts until they fall flat. It's looking like a story, man, it's all cap. But it's goodness over darkness, it ain't all bad. I'm at my maker, but I was called back. Emmanuel, show my people they're under a spell. Heaven or hell is free will. I made my choice and now it's well with my soul. I pray the same for you as well. Welcome to the Godcast. Welcome to the Godcast.
Hello, everybody. On today's episode, I have on a guest who has researched spirituality, religions, and the truth of who we are. He has some very interesting concepts and ideas about all of these things and more. He is an artist, producer, and author of the book, The Lucifer Mystery Revealed. Everyone, welcome Esoteric Eddie to the show.
Hello.
Welcome to the show, my friend.
Thank you for having me here.
Yeah, I'm glad to finally get you on. We first met on the Rising from the Ashes roundtable about God and the devil, Satan, Lucifer type deal. And it was a very expansive conversation that we had. And I've been anticipating talking to you again because of that.
Yeah, that was a fun one. We got deep into some stuff for sure.
Yeah,
it was cool. Wajid was interesting. I went to go look up some of his stuff afterwards, and yeah, he's the real deal for sure.
Yeah, I have to get him on still as well. It's been a very busy few weeks for me, so I haven't had too much space, but I'm so glad to get you in and talk to you and get into not only the Lucifer mysteries that you wrote your book about, but also the topic of Ethiopia. And that is very, very fascinating as well, because I've done a little bit of stuff on Ethiopia only because it came extended from the Book of Enoch research that I was doing. So it lines up very well there. So we'll get into that. But why don't you tell our audience a little bit about yourself?
Sure. All right. So, of course, I'm Esoteric Eddie, or Eddie. About 27 years old now. I've been researching the occult, the esoteric, and conspiratorial for over 10 years. got into it around 12 to 14 years old, started getting into psychedelics, into certain music, and just researching heavily in that area, that time period of my life. But my whole life is kind of revolved around the esoteric. Grew up in a Catholic and Christian home and kind of started being fascinated and intrigued by the Bible and its deeper mysteries at an early age. And as I progressed throughout my teen years and my young adult years, I started to try to use my skills to express and educate what I knew through videos and through writings. So I had some successes along the way. Developed eventually.
Uh-oh.
Am I still here?
Yeah,
Yeah.
a little bit. The picture's frozen, but we can hear you now.
Oh, there you go.
Okay, you're back.
All right. So as I developed, pretty much from 14 years old of learning all this stuff about secret societies and aliens and all the basic stuff, as that progressed, I tried to take my skills and utilize them to express and educate some of the stuff I was learning. So I had some early variations of YouTube channels and early variations of my writings that in my mind were cool, but they weren't successful. They were my early failures. And then right around 25 years old, which was a couple years ago for me now, almost 3 years ago, I just decided to revamp all of that and, started the Esoteric Eddie content and also wrote my second book, which is the Lucifer Mystery Revealed, and took the time and effort to do these things more professionally this time around. And it paid off. Things are definitely more successful and people are being more receptive to the work now.
Oh, very cool. I mean, 27 years old, you're a fairly young man and you've already written 2 books. I mean, that's pretty accomplished work for someone. It seems like you were on a trajectory of maturity at a young age and that you came into existence with an understanding of, okay, I have more to do here, that I'm not just here to mess around. Like I did a lot of messing around in my young teenage years and all. It seems like you were on this path of figuring things out from an early age. So hats off to you for that.
Thank you. Definitely. It's been a long journey. Still ain't over.
Yeah. Did you say the name of your first book?
No, but it's out there. You can't buy a copy right now because I'm actually revamping it.
Okay.
Gonna re-release it this summer. Yeah, it's gonna be pretty cool. It's gonna be really dope. I'm adding so much more to it, but it is titled the Anunnaki Theorem. So it's mostly about the
Ooh.
Anunnaki.
Okay.
Right up your alley.
Yeah, and that goes right into the Book of Enoch as well. So I mean, this is some very fascinating stuff here. So let's get into the Lucifer mysteries a bit because I have a lot of Christians listen to my podcast, and there's a lot of people who. So when people come to my podcast, they're not really hardcore Christians. That they were in the Christian church and they still feel that there's some truth to it, but they're not really sure. And then there's others who are starting to see that there is some truth in it, but they aren't indoctrinated into it. So when we have this idea of Lucifer, we really have this image of one man that was doing who knows what. It comes down to people think he's Satan, that so many different things. But then when you break the language down of the interpretation of his name and all, it really is a strange phenomenon itself. So why don't you break down the word Lucifer to begin with?
Absolutely, absolutely. And before I get into that, I just want to say I grew up in a Catholic and Christian home, so I understand, the Christian mindset, and
Right.
I still hold some, some admiration and understanding for that point of view, for sure. But yeah, so I started studying Lucifer and its etymology and its historicity, and what I found was fascinating. So before I wrote the book, I just simply asked myself, where did we get the idea of Lucifer? Where did that come from? And then when I started answering those questions, what I found was the world, primarily the Western world, was introduced to Lucifer through the King James Bible. Now, in the King James Bible, the word or name Lucifer is used once, and it's used as an uppercase noun, a name, and it's used in the famous Isaiah 14:12 verse. O Lucifer, how art thou fallen, etc. But when you take the translations further back, we start to see how we got to this, conundrum of viewing Lucifer as this entity. So, of course, the Bible was translated from the Hebrew. The Old Testament was translated from the Hebrew. So, from the English, we go to the Latin, and then from the Latin, we go to the Greek, and then the Hebrew. So, in the Latin is actually where the word Lucifer first appeared, because Lucifer is a Latin word. But in the Latin Vulgate, which the Roman Catholic Church used, the word Lucifer is used multiple times. And every time, including in the Isaiah verse, it's used as a lowercase adjective. And in the Greek version, the Septuagint, we don't see Lucifer, we see the word phosphorus. And in the Hebrew, we see the word Hallel ben Shahar. Now, the Greek and the Latin versions translated Hallel ben Shahar correctly as adjectives, because Hallel ben Shahar is referring to a Canaanite deity by the name of Hallel, and as we know, Ben is the Hebrew word for son. So Hallel ben Shahar is saying Hallel, son of Shahar. But Hallel can also mean something bright or shiny. So, and the Greek word phosphorus, so the Greek word phosphorus is the correct translation for Hallel. Phosphorus in Greek can mean something bright or shiny. And of course, in the Latin, Lucifer as a lowercase word also can mean something bright or shiny, because it consists of two root words, lus, light, and then fere, to bring or to bear. So that's where the occult got the idea of Lucifer being the light bearer, because of the two root words for the Latin word Lucifer. But what makes it all more interesting is that Hallel, the Canaanite deity, is also a representation, or is represented by the star or planet Venus. And the Greek phosphorus and the Latin Lucifer are also words that can also be used to represent Venus. And there's a reason for this, because when Isaiah, he was a very well educated and intellectual, prophet and scribe. So in my understanding, or I would imagine that he knew, about the ancient world, right? Because Judaism can be broken up into two different categories, pre-exilic Judaism and post-exilic Judaism. Now, scholars have pointed out that pre-exilic Judaism was very, very loose. It was a very loose community ideologically. They were pretty much polytheistic, and they were kind of pulling from the old world, the old Canaanite world. And then, the Babylonian captivity happened. And then through that captivity, they kind of unified, and then all the elders kind of came together and started to put together the Bible.
Canonize.
Canonize. Yeah, I kind of got confused with Canaanites and Canaanites. But the elders put it together, and then post-exilic Judaism is where we see like modern Judaism starting to form, this unified religion where Yahweh is monotheistic, and we start to see these early iterations of judgment days and heaven and hell. But we uncovered some ancient Canaanite texts in the 1930s, and among those we found a text called the Baal cycle text. And in the Baal cycle text, we see these stories of Baal, this ancient Canaanite deity, kind of like journeying around and setting up his dominion. And in one of those stories, we see a surprise guest of Hallel, but he's not known as Hallel. He's known as Athtar. And in the pre-exilic Judaism in the Canaanite world, there was a pantheon of gods, all headed by El. And Baal, he's like the notorious god in those times, kind of similar to the Babylonian Marduk, kind of always hell bent for power and stuff like that. and there's all these other lower deities. And in the Baal cycle text, we see Shahar. Shahar is a deity, and his son is not Hallel, but it's Athtar. And Athtar in the Canaanite world was symbolized by Venus. And what's interesting is Athtar is a male version of the female Astarte, also known as Ishtar, and the Sumerian name of Inanna. And all three of those goddesses are represented by Venus. So this idea of Venus and Astar and Athtar kind of progressed throughout the ages. And then for whatever reason, Isaiah used the word Hallel, or used the name Hallel to represent Astar and all these other deities. So what Isaiah was saying, and again, when if you read the Isaiah verse, he's not talking about a Lucifer. He's actually condemning and insulting the Babylonian kings, because Isaiah was written, I believe, right around when the Babylonians were starting to take over Judaism. So he was, being a prophet, he was foreseeing the downfall of these Babylonian kings. And he said to the Babylonian kings, you are like Hallel ben Shahar, you are like Athtar, and you are like Venus, because Venus's celestial mythology, even in astronomy, in our own skies, Venus is the brightest celestial object in the morning preceding the sun. So there's all these entendres and metaphors and ancient stories being wrapped up into this poetic insult that Isaiah is giving to the Babylonian kings, and saying, you are like Venus, you are like Athtar. You think that you are something, bright, something that will last, but the sun or God will, soon come and overshadow you.
Wow, that was a great wealth of information. So many different mythologies. If I don't really like that word, but that's kind of how it's used. Pantheons, maybe is a better word. Yeah. So Aphrodite was also the goddess Venus, and Venus being the morning star, like you said, it's the brightest thing in the morning, and then the sun comes and takes over. And the thing about Venus, which is very weird, is a lot of ancient cultures say that when it was formed, it was in the shape of a serpent, that it was probably a gas, and it's not a solid uh, planet. It's not rock like the other ones, that it was formed, and it was like a serpent. It was very long and thin, cylindrical, that was moving about in different ways, and then it came to be as one thing, as if it was a piece of the sun and broke out of it, which kind of could be the son of the sun, in that same manner. Very interesting. So Shahar, you mentioned him a few times there. So was Shahar a good deity? Was he an evil deity? Was he just one of the people?
From what I can gather and what I've read, he was just kind of a neutral god. In the old Canaanite world, it was El was the prime deity, and then again Baal or Baal, he was kind of like this hell bent, like younger deity who eventually took over, and then that's when like Babylon came to power. But Shahar, from what I can see, was just kind of a neutral god. It wasn't
Okay.
really that all powerful or meaningful.
Well, that's very interesting that his son would then be the one who is accredited for being the son of God and
Mm.
being this mighty ruler here. So it's very fascinating.
Yeah.
I would have to look into Shahar a bit, and it all goes really into how language was kept without vowels back then. So when you're saying, Baal, Baal, it's kind of really difficult to see how it would be pronounced, because they just use the consonants, and now we fill in the different vowels. So you could see how maybe L and Baal or Baal, it could be the something off of the other thing. It's very
Yeah.
interesting, and it goes.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Oh yeah, no, what I forgot to mention too, and the reason Hallel or Athtar is seen as this like fallen deity is because in the Baal cycle text, there's a little story where Baal steps down from his throne for whatever reason, and then the gods are congregating amongst themselves well, who should rule in his stead? And Athtar steps up to, the responsibility. And then in the story, he sits on Baal's throne, but realizes he's too small. His feet can't reach the floor. So then he steps down, and then he says, well, I'm not fit to rule. So it's kind of like an old world little like tale and metaphor, like, oh, like you're like Athtar, you're not fit to rule.
Very interesting. And when you start talking about Mimi, we were talking about before we started. Mimi's reading this book, and last night she was reading it out loud to me. And in this book, this gentleman, what's it called, the language crystal?
Mm-hmm.
So this gentleman is talking about the names Ra and El, saying Ra is the external God and El is the internal God.
External light.
External
internal
light.
light.
Right.
Yes.
And El was the internal light. So it's very interesting. El.
So what you were saying about Baal would be okay. Never mind. Sorry.
Yeah. Well,
just thinking out loud.
Yeah, it's very interesting how everything gets changed just a little bit here and there throughout the history. So Lucifer, most Christians, or just most people in general, in at least America, think Lucifer is the devil, is Satan, but then we look at what he's accredited for. Now, I'm not discounting anything you just said. Obviously, you just broke down for us that it was a mistranslation. The name Lucifer was an adjective describing someone who was bringing light. But so people have this image that he's like this red devil, but then it talks about he was the most beautiful angel, and that he was the angel of music and the angel of gemstones, and that he was given abilities that none of the other angels had access to, that he was the number one angel. But then he's depicted as the devil, and we're told it's Satan. And then we find out that Satan means adversary. And then it gets in a very weird and complicated space where people are trying to describe one thing with these three different names, but then sometimes we use the three different names separately because we're describing different things. It's like we're putting one into three and then three back into one, but it doesn't actually line up. It's all a lot of sorcery and magic with the words and trickery. Now, what have you come across in terms of Satan?
Now, Satan kind of the word and the concept kind of has a similar progression. So, from what I've read and studied, Satan was also used as a lowercase in early Judaism, and the term was Ha Satan, so it's like the Satan or a Satan, and anybody could really be a Satan. In those old days, it was a term for an adversary. But Satan's role in early Judaism wasn't really an enemy of God. He was to be used by God. He was like an employee of God. God employed Satan to test mankind and to test Jesus. But later on, it was later Christian ideology that kind of again turned the lowercase Satan into an uppercase Satan and concreted it as like now a pronoun, right? But there's all sorts of studies about Satan kind of coming from the Zoroastrian religion, the idea of Ahura Mazda versus Angra Mainyu. And there's some good speculation for that, because when the Jews were held in captivity by the Babylonians, later on it was the Persian King Cyrus who freed them and set them free. And Cyrus was very tolerant of religions, and let his subjects in the different areas that he ruled practice their native religions. And when the Babylonians took the Jews captive, it was their practice not to take the lower ranking people. They would only specifically take the elites. So when the Babylonians took them, they took the elites, the priests, the royal families, and held them captive. So naturally, when Cyrus came and freed them, these elites started to mingle with the Persians, and some of them stayed there. And this is when the diaspora diaspora began, when the Jews being in different lands and willingly staying there. So these elites started mingling with the Persians, and at that time, Zoroastrianism was like the main religion of the Persians, and they started to mingle and interact and you know uh, transfer ideas, share ideas, ideologies, and that's when we start to see all these like concrete ideas in Judaism about the God and devil and judgment day and a heaven and hell start to form, and all of that is preceded in Zoroastrianism. Zoroastrianism has very strict philosophies about this good God named Ahura Mazda and this evil God named Angra Mainyu, and also these early ideas of angels and stuff like that.
Okay. Do you know when Zoroastrianism, or am I saying that right? Zoroastrianism, when that was started?
It's a legendary thing. It's hard to pin down. Scholars, basically, they say around 1200 BC, and it centers itself around its religious writings. The
Mm.
the Avesta, the Avesta it's a culmination of sacred writings, and in those writings, the Gathas are said to have been directly written by Zoroaster. So when you're reading the Gathas, those are Zoroaster's words. And Zoroaster, that's the Greek word. That's the Greek translation of his word. His Persian name was Zarathustra.
Okay.
Zarathustra. But the scholars put his actual life date around 1200 BC, but it could go farther back than that. It's very legendary and hard to pin down. But the Avesta itself, again, was probably written around 1200 BC.
Okay, and that's around the time I think that Zeus was came down, was it would have been in Greece, not necessarily uh where this was taking place at, but it's an interesting time. We had on someone named Ed Dodge back, I think, episode 55, where he broke down these different pantheons for us about the time that the the current day structure that we have and know started around 1200 BC. That's when things really shook up. That the
Mhm.
feminism type of thing was kind of taken out for whatever reason, and I'm still trying to pin someone down to find out what exactly was going on with this mother son worship type deal. So
Yeah.
that's another conversation for another day. But it seems that 1200 BC things started to change, which is interesting because it is very far after the flood.
Yeah, Moses was like 1300 BC.
Moses was way before that. Moses, well, I don't know if it was way before. So when the flood was like what 2400 BC. So we're talking about 1200 years later that it's populated enough to have this type of thing happen. So it's a very weird and confusing thing. So I don't want to get too
Yeah.
sidetracked off that, but it's a
Yeah.
weird time period.
Yeah. Some people even speculate uh, that Zoroaster was Moses. There's
Ah,
definitely that conspiracy out there.
okay.
Yeah,
So
it's
yeah.
deep.
Yeah, so yeah, I was probably wrong when I just said to Mimi. Well, I was thinking Noah. That's what when she said that I was in the wrong place at the wrong time. So sorry, my love.
It's okay. It happens.
Okay, so now the devil. Have you come across anything that tells you about the devil, where that comes from?
A little bit. So like the devil, I would say is more so the image of like the goat, right? Like the horned beast. And I don't go into that in my book too much, and I go into Satan a little bit. But the devil, I would say, kind of stems from the goat imagery. And this is just me kind of freestyling right now based on what I know. And for example, and I do mention this in the book, uh, the idea of goats being used for sacrifice in Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement, one of the most holy holidays for the Jews, actually has has some source in the fallen angel story. So on Yom Kippur, originally they would sacrifice two goats, and one of the goats was to atone for the sins of the people, and the other goat they would project all the sins of the fallen angels, specifically Azazel, who is the leader of the fallen angels in the book of Enoch, or one of the leaders at least, and they would cause this goat to fly off a cliff to signify the fallen angels and to appease God, like, you know, to atone for their sins and kind of separate them, like willingly, deliberately separating and consciously saying, like, we do not side with the fallen angels. Like, we understand that sin was created by them, or some of it at least. So the idea of the goat early on was starting to form, and then as time progressed, especially in like the medieval ages, a lot of artists, a lot of occult artists and Christian artists started to signify the devil as a goat. And then, of course, you have Eliphas Levi, who drew up the Baphomet image, and then it just kind of really took off from there. And actually, he never drew that to signify the devil. He was a mystical Catholic, trippy guy, and that image was actually just a metaphor, a symbolic metaphor for all kinds of different occult things. But yeah, I guess I would say the devil kind of stems from the whole goat imagery, and that was heavily misunderstood as well.
Yeah, it's interesting that I think it's Krampus is actually being depicted in like 300. I think that Krampus probably came to Earth somehow. It's very weird to think about that there was this uh, goat-like or bull-like being that was humanoid. So I do some energy work, and I had this client, and I was working on her, and what I saw was Krampus. Now, at the time, I didn't know it was Krampus, but I'm telling her, I'm seeing that there's this black bull being with a human face that stands up like a human, and it is surrounding you. I don't want to get too into detail, but it was very dark what I was seeing, and it was very disgusting. It's not a language that I would say was going on the podcast, but it was very deep what was happening.
Yeah.
And I see this black bull, and I mean it was jet black, like when I say a bull, I was like, it's a bull, but it's a man. I didn't really have the words to describe it because we don't really have anything to describe it. Then 2 days later, I come across the image of Krampus in the 300s, and I'm like, "Oh my god, that is what
Yeah.
I saw." It was very, very fascinating that I saw this image, and I'm like, "Okay, that is the devil." Then you look into what Krampus is, and Krampus goes around on Christmas, and he hurts those who are non-believers. And it's
Wow.
saying if you're a non-believer that you can be hurt by the devil. And now you roll that into our understanding of the devil and Satan being the same thing, and then Lucifer just being the original name of it. And you can see how things got twisted and perverted and misunderstood and mistranslated to see that these three different things at three different times have all rolled into one because Krampus was the adversary. So it could have been called Satan. And, Lucifer just gets thrown in there because of the mistranslation of the Bible. But it's a very, very strange thing that occurred. And before we transitioned into Ethiopia a bit here, I did want to say that this quote unquote download that I got when I was listening to your interview, I listened to you on both The Great Deception and on Rising from the Ashes. So I suggest everyone go check out those podcasts as well because they're great in their own fashion. So I'm listening to those ones, and I'm not sure which one it was exactly, but I get this quote unquote download, and God tells me a Lucifer is someone who brings moral and immoral knowledge. A Satan is someone who suggests you do the immoral thing. He's the adversary, so he doesn't want you to do moral behaviors. And then a devil is someone who pushes you to do immoral things so that he can then punish you. And then God kind of told me that Samael was his highest angel. And Samael went and turned around and created this entire existence, and that he gave the immoral and moral knowledge, and that's when he became Lucifer. And then at some point, he started to push the immoral knowledge. And then to atone for his sins, he started to push the immoral knowledge so that he could then punish you to try to make up for bringing you the information in the first place to tell you how wrong you are for doing it. So then he became the devil, and that was kind of his trajectory, or not trajectory, but his fall from grace. Was he was doing things on his own understandings rather than relying on God of how to do things. But Proverbs 3:5, don't rely on your own understandings, because we can't really understand what's going on. So it was a very weird download, but it made so much sense to me in the moment, because I'm listening to you break it down and I'm like, yeah. And I've heard similar things before, uh,
Yeah.
but you really broke it down. And when I'm listening, it's just like my mind was opened up and God kind of gave me that information. But he always said a Lucifer, a Satan, a devil. He didn't say that there was one until he told me that the original one was Samael, that went to Lucifer, then to Satan, then to the devil, and so on. So it's a very interesting thing. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, no, that's like a really cool and interesting way to view it, and it does make sense. And yeah, I think a lot of what we're dealing with are archetypes, archetypes and even entities that we come across. We don't understand them, but they seem to be coming from a realm that's not, foreseeable here. And that's something that I've dealt with in my personal life, and I don't get into that in my work, but it is something that I'm heavily fascinated with. Like I listened to your podcast with The Exorcist. I'm fascinated by stuff like that, and I've tried to kind of understand what these things are through psychology and through scripture and different things. And what I'm starting to realize, at least for myself, is that there is there's a realm of the collective subconscious, as Carl Jung would have put it, and archetypes, images, and names. These are just little fancy ways for the mind to understand the spirit realm or the subconscious realm. So for your download to say that these are just, a Lucifer, a Satan, it's kind of like saying, like, yeah, like, don't get too wrapped up into these ideas. They're archetypes, but the energy behind these archetypes is real, and it is forming, and it could have stemmed off from an original entity, Samael. And historically speaking, it's interesting too, because all this stuff about devils and Lucifers, it all stems from the idea of the fallen angels. And the Book of Enoch is probably the only biblical scripture that we have that tells us a detailed story about that. And yeah, I mean, according to the Book of Enoch, there were angels, and some of these angels decided to break off, and among them was Azazel and Samael. And then so from there, the schism occurred of all these fallen angels. So without the original fallen angels breaking off and doing what they did, even just theologically or conceptually speaking, there would be no devils or Lucifers.
Yeah, yeah, it's very interesting. And when we get into the Garden of Eden, it doesn't even say Satan. The character that tempted Eve is unnamed, and a lot of people don't know that. They really just are regurgitating information, and we're all guilty of doing it at some point, because we don't really have the ability to check and go recheck every single thing we ever say. So I'm
Just
not
like the
condemning
apple is
anyone.
not mentioned
Right,
as
there's
an
no
apple.
Apple, right, it just gets
Yeah.
changed
Right.
into that. But then we have, Apple, the company, and they have a bite out of the apple, and, we know what that stands for now that we're awake to everything. But when we're just saying, "Oh, yeah, Satan tempted Eve," it's like, no, it wasn't Satan, it was a Satan, it was one of the seraphim that went and tempted Eve, and it's probably wasn't with, they say, forbidden fruit, but it was probably sex. It wasn't an actual food. It was
Yeah.
having sex and procreating with another being that was here, because they were seraphim angels. This is and this is where it gets really weird, that there were beings that were snake-like or reptilian-like, that all are angels, and we would know them as dragons, or Chinese dragons. They really depict it very well. And then you get into the word dragon, and what was said to happen to the being that introduced the forbidden fruit to Eve was he was made to crawl on his belly. And the word dragon is he's dragging himself because he has to crawl on his belly, and he has that one little arm that he can reach out and drag his hind side with. And where, so when we get into, did dragons really exist on Earth, we have this thing called dinosaurs that just appeared in the 1800s that is just covering up these dragons and giant lizards that existed. And there's one dinosaur specifically that they only ever had the head to the tailbone, and it's called a T-Rex, and it has one little arm that you can't do anything with, but they put legs on it. The artist rendition put legs on it, but if it didn't have legs, then it's an actual depiction, and you can see that it's just the head to the spine, because that's all a seraphim was at that point. It could only drag itself, or they were flying around, so that they didn't have legs. It's a very weird and interesting thing. But if seraphim were flying around, and then this one was made to crawl on its belly, its wings were taken off, essentially, that could explain everything.
Yeah, it gets deep and interesting. The word that was used in the Hebrew for the Adam and Eve story, it wasn't snake, but it was serpent, and the word was nakash. Nakash, and in Hebrew is very playful in its words, and a lot of the words have double meanings, and the Bible is very symbolic and metaphorical and poetic. So the word nakash can mean serpent, but it can also mean someone who's wise or a diviner. So it's almost like they were calling this person a serpent as an insult, but also kind of giving us a clue as to who it could have been, by also using that word nakash, which could also mean a diviner or somebody of wisdom. And the whole thing with dinosaurs is interesting too. Yeah, it kind of creeps me out thinking about that, because they push that on the kids so much, of them just being these dinosaurs, these creatures, because we love them. I loved the dinosaurs growing up. But then when you start getting into it, like, wait, like, what were these things really? And like, why were they just exterminated? Like, it is kind of creepy. There's something eerie going on with that. And it's also interesting how in Gnosticism, Yaldabaoth, right, like the false god of this reality, is depicted as a snake with the head of a lion.
Yeah. Wow. I didn't even know that that's how he's depicted.
Who is that? I missed it.
Yaldabaoth. That is the quote unquote god of this world, according to Gnostic, saying he only was mimicking what he saw, because he only had an image of heaven, because he was born, he's the demiurge, and he was born out of lust, maybe, I'm not too sure, out of Sophia, out of wisdom, and it's a very strange thing. But so you're saying the serpent with the image of the head of a lion? I have seen this, and I've
Like
talked
the
about
Chinese
it.
dragon.
Yes, the Chinese dragon, that's exactly what it is. So when I saw this was in a psychedelic trip, and I was babysitting, so I couldn't go fully into the trip. So I
Not
was
a child, not babysitting children.
I was babysitting other
Adults.
people who were
Okay.
their first time doing psychedelics.
All right,
Yes,
all right.
thanks for clearing that up, Mimi.
You're welcome.
So
You don't need any knocks on the door.
yes, yes, very true. So what I saw was the dragon described in Revelation with 7 heads and 10 horns, and each of the heads were different colors, and the lowest was purple. It was the reverse of the chakra system. The lowest was purple, and or indigo, and then blue, and then green, and then yellow, then orange, then red. Red was at the top for whatever reason, and that's the one I was interacting with. So like these heads had different dominion over these different realms. So when they're different colors, it was like I was passing by these records on records, and when I got to the top, that's where the one that was red was at. And so when I got there and I arrived to that place, it was roaring at me. Its mouth was open, and it was like a terrifying type of thing, where its mouth was much larger than I was. and I'm like, oh my God, there's a lion roaring in my face. And this was just after I was checking on the people that I was sitting with. And so when I went back and closed my eyes, so it was very vivid for me. It was like I put on goggles and saw this. Yeah, when
Yeah.
she gets the chills when I speak the truth, it's very funny. So then I see it closes its mouth, and I see that it's a Chinese dragon. It has a mustache, and I'm like, oh, it's not a lion, it's a dragon. And then I look down and I see one claw, one short little arm with three claws, sharp as a bear. And I'm like, oh wow. And I see that it's red. The whole thing is red, but it's not really filled in color like we are, like we're
Yeah.
solid color. Like this was kind of like a blueprint where it's not that you can see through it, but the outline of it is a darker red than the inner part. It's a little bit lighter.
Like a CAD drawing type thing in
Yeah.
red.
Yeah. So when I saw that, I was like, oh, that's the beast of Revelation that I'm seeing. And it was definitely a serpent with 7 heads, 10 horns, and I think 4 of the heads had 1 horn and 3 of them had 2. The different colors, and the one that was red specifically, had the face of a lion. It had, or the mouth of a lion, the arm of a bear. And when it says the spots of a leopard, I think it's talking about the scales, because like I was saying, you can see outlines of the scales, but the rest of it isn't colored in the same dark red, so that
Yeah.
it will look like they're spots of a leopard. So I saw that, and maybe that was Yaldabaoth. Maybe that's
Yeah.
when I saw it, I was like, that's Satan. That's what they're talking about as Satan. That's the dragon, the beast. What's your thoughts on that?
Well, that's deep, man. Psychedelics can definitely bring you to the other realm and show you some interesting things, some downloads. And no, I mean that's wild. What I was thinking of while you're saying that, I was thinking about China, right? Because I
Mhm.
feel like the Bible is symbolic and it is
Me too.
metaphoric, right? A lot of it, but I feel like a lot of it all is also very political and and trying to warn us about certain things that are going to take place on this earth.
Mm-hmm.
And I feel like the whole dragon and all this and stuff like that. I mean, that is like China's national. I mean, I don't know. I'm not an expert on China, but it is like one of the most famous symbols that comes out of China
Right, I was
is
gonna
this
say it's
dragon.
always a red dragon that they're celebrating
Yeah.
with, like always a red one. Sometimes I see green, but I'm not sure if that's China.
Yeah, and I don't want to instigate anything,
Right.
but I mean, obviously today, every day in the news, every week, it's something about China, China this and China that, and we have very intense tension with China right now, politically, financially, a lot of war games being played, and so when I think about Revelations and all these symbologies of the dragon, I just think about China. And another thing that I wanted to mention, this was just kind of a little random thing, but I remember a couple years back, it must have been, oh man, I don't know, like 3 years ago, 3 or 4 years ago, I was just laying down, just kind of scrolling through my phone on YouTube, and I come across this like Fox News or CNN video, one of those mainstream news channels. And for whatever random reason, they were talking about Kim Jong Un from North Korea, and they played a little clip of him riding on a white horse just randomly, and they're like, "Oh, King Jong Un, this he's just, riding his horses in the snow." Like I don't know why they were talking about him and stuff, but I see him just riding on a white horse, and I was like, "Oh shit!" Like this is crazy. This is like literally right out of the Book of Revelations,
Yeah.
Yeah, it's forced.
So no, it's wild, man. I think there's different ways that we get information to us from the spirit realm. Some of it is through imagery, but I feel like that imagery and stuff like that needs to be further downloaded and decoded into the real world, and so that we can see, the way things are unfolding.
Yeah, you just produced some thoughts in me when you were saying China, because as above, so below. When I'm seeing this image, if it was only Earth, then it would be in multiple different places. And the dragon, so if the dragon is in China, then the bear claw is Russia.
Of course.
The the mouth of a lion would be America, possibly. I mean, I know America's usually represented by the eagle, but I mean, we are the talking, the attacker, the protector, if you will, of everything else. And then the spotted leopard is the official animal of Iran. So you got the four biggest powers, or most dangerous warmongering powers, are all depicted in that one image that's talked about in the Book of Revelation. And look at where we are. I mean, we're literally about to go to war. I mean, I can't get too into detail about things, but there is the backups who aren't supposed to be deployed are being deployed, and we've actually known about this for like 7 months now, that people were being sent to Poland in March. I mean, we've known about this for some time, and it's just when we are where we are and we see, we're led to believe that we're in the Book of Revelation. I think that it's kind of forced, like Mimi was saying.
Manufactured to seem like that, so that, to keep the fear going.
Right, but it's a very weird place to be in, and I don't want to get too into politics or current day things with you here, especially you're so educated on all the other things. If you do have anything to say on that before we move on, you're more than welcome to.
Yeah, well, conspiratorial policies and politics is actually another area that I heavily study. So, but that's more like my personal side. I don't try to project that into my content because, of course, you split people right away when you start talking politics. But no, it is something that I heavily study and follow. But it's just on the Book of Revelations, I kind of agree. I always say that the Book of Revelations is a blueprint. It's not something that necessarily has to happen, but it's something that could happen if we don't pay attention to ourselves and the world.
Yeah, I think it's
definitely a blueprint that they use a lot. And the very, when I'm studying Bibles and I'm going back to like the very first inkling of a Bible, Revelations isn't even included, which I thought was very odd. And I haven't gotten into why or what yet. But I did find out that little factoid that Revelations was not one of the quote unquote original pieces of the Bible.
Well, and it's interesting what the name of that book actually is the revelation of Jesus Christ. So its meaning is that we're all going to have the revelation that Jesus Christ is God, or something to that effect, that we're all going to realize Jesus Christ is within us, something to that effect, however someone wants to really put it. But I've combed over history, and I think it's happened already. That it's almost happened many different times, that there's been different people and places that fit certain aspects of it. But then you look at a more grand scale and you could say, okay, well, it's happened here, was this part, then hundreds of years later was this part, then hundreds of years later. So, everything's microcosms and macrocosms. The same things are repeating themselves on larger and smaller scales, so on and so forth. But I do want to now transition into the Book of Enoch and Ethiopia specifically. So when I got into the Book of Enoch, it really started bringing me to Ethiopia. And I tweeted out something this morning, which I also put on my Instagram, was that the completion number is the number 7. And the number of man is the number 6. So meaning that man is like one step away from being complete, that we're not yet complete. And when we look in the Book of Enoch, the fall of the fallen angels, when they fell to earth, so not when they initially sinned, but when they fell to earth and became physical amongst us, because God told them they will die like men, that was during the 6th generation from Adam and Eve. That was during Jared. And then in the 7th generation, Enoch was raptured. So he was completed. The 7th, he was the only one who went up. So we have all this symbolic nature going on. Again, things are happening on larger and smaller scales, but that these fallen angels came down during the fall of man in the 6th generation, and then the 7th man was sent back up. Now, how this gets to Ethiopia is when I did my breakdown of the book of Enoch, I start to put some pieces together. There's the Eritrean Sea that is right in Egypt and Ethiopia, which we know as the Red Sea. But back in biblical times, back when Enoch was alive, it was called the Eritrean Sea. Now, there's this defense force, terrorists, that are called the Eritrean defense forces that came and killed between 800 to 1,000 monks and different people who were in the church, because Ethiopia is a Christian nation. They killed them trying to get the Ark of the Covenant from Ethiopia. And the whole reason why Enoch is involved in this is because when he is being shown the entire earth, he's being flown about, he points out the Eritrean Sea. He says, oh, yeah, there's the Eritrean Sea right there, as if he knew it because he was very familiar with it. He wouldn't have just pointed out any sea, but he only points out that's the only place. So I really feel that he was from Ethiopia, and they have a very interesting history with Christianity and Judaism as well. So do you want to walk us through a little bit of what you found in
Yeah.
terms of Ethiopia being Christian and Jewish?
Yeah. So apparently there was a Christian by the name of Frumentius, and I forgot where he was from, but him and his brother were shipwrecked and I guess stumbled upon Ethiopia back in like the year 500 BC, I believe. No, sorry, not BC, 500 AD. And Frumentius showed one of the rulers at the time Christianity and kind of taught him the ways, and that ruler was Izana. So the Ethiopian ruler Izana was the first to Christianize Ethiopia around 500 AD. And then from then on, it's been a Christian nation. But it also has an interesting community of Jews, what are known as Black Jews, also known as Falashas. Falashas is kind of like a derogatory term that the Ethiopians use towards them. It means like stranger or exile. But they kind of like taken that word and kind of reclaim power in it, some of them. But they're Jews, and they claim to be Jews of the house of Israel. What they call themselves is the Beta Israel, which means of the house of Israel. So they call themselves the Beta Israelians. And it's interesting. They've been there apparently for thousands of years. And they live in these little villages, these little like communities in the countryside. And they sport the Star of David. They put it on their pottery, on their buildings, and they know how to speak Hebrew. And they follow not just some of the holidays of today, but holidays going all the way back to like pre-exilic Judaism, very like a rudimentary, like archaic holidays that some of the modern churches of today don't even follow anymore. And I learned most of this from Graham Hancock. He has a book called The Great Seal, where he wrote about his journeys in Ethiopia and discovering all this stuff. And he also has a documentary on it too. But it's a very strange thing. They speak Hebrew. They have holidays, not just modern ones, but going all the way back to ancient times. And they're kind of an ousted community. And the Christian aspect of it, the interesting about it is that Ethiopia has one of the world's oldest illustrated Christian Bible. They have some very old manuscript versions, and they have some very like fascinating churches. For example, some that are known as the Lalibela churches. There's about, I think, 7 or 11 of them, somewhere around there, and they're cut out of the rock, and they're like sub level. So it's like you're standing on the ground, and then they go like underground, but they're like cut out of the rock into like downward, and they're just amazing things to look at. But yeah, there's a lot going on there. And as far as the legends, they have this claim that one of their kings, King Menelik, was actually the son of Solomon and the biblical Queen of Sheba, who they call Queen Makeda. And this is sort of attested in the Bible. There is a Queen of Sheba, apparently from Ethiopia in the Bible, who goes to visit King Solomon. And there's not much said other than that they spend the night together. And she's just fascinated by him and his wisdom. And she goes over there to just learn from him. And then other things happen. But the Ethiopians have a version of that tale in a sacred text known as the Kebra Nagast, the glory of kings. And it goes into that story into more detail. And that's when we learn that Solomon and the Queen of Sheba had a son by the name of King Menelik. And him and his people, according to this book, brought the Ark of the Covenant back with them. And then ever since then, there's also a strange tradition in Ethiopia during what is called the I forgot the name of the festival. I don't want to butcher it, but there's a festival. It's like a 30-day festival or something. No, sorry, like 3-day festival. And during these festivals, the priests of all the churches, they erect mocks of the Ark of the Covenant, and they carry it on their heads all the way to one of the main churches. And so to this day, Ethiopia claims to have the Ark of the Covenant specifically in the church known as the Church of Saint Mary of Zion. So Ethiopia has one of the oldest Christian communities, some of the oldest Christian manuscripts. It has a strange group of Black Jews who apparently go back to thousands of years, who practice archaic Judaic holidays and rituals. And they also have festivals centered around the Ark of the Covenant, and also have priests and monks who outwardly claim that the Ark of the Covenant is there and that nobody can see it other than the one priest who has his life dedicated to overseeing it. So there's no other place in the world with all those different claims and traditions. So there's something definitely going on there.
Why is it that you think no one else can see this Ark of the Covenant?
Well, they actually say that everyone who's ever been, because it's always passed down to one person, that to watch it, is that they become blinded by the Ark of the Covenant because it's maybe some kind of piece of God, that it's so I don't know if it's like nuclear energy or something, radiation, that it just blinds you when you look at it. Now, is this gentleman blind? Do you know?
He's not, but in Graham Hancock's book, sorry, it's actually The Sign and the Seal. That's what it's called, The Sign and the Seal. In the book, he talks about one of the priests that he met who used to take care of it is blind. But I don't know if it was because of the Ark of the Covenant. But in the Bible, I believe there's a story where some priests try to look at it and then they're like instantly blinded or killed.
Yeah.
So even in the Bible, I mean, this piece of whatever technology or just artifact has some sort of power to it that can blind you, kill you, cause sickness, but it can also do other crazy things like split oceans and cause buildings to fall down.
Part of Red Sea.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, and the interesting thing is when Ethiopia, this is their legend, that they came and took the Ark of the Covenant because other forces were fighting about it in Jerusalem, or maybe not Jerusalem as we know it, but somewhere over there in the Middle East, that they were fighting over. And then Ethiopia is like, we're just going to take it because you guys don't know what you're doing. You know, we're just going to come hide it. And what ends up happening in Ethiopia, it's twice in the 1700s or early 1800s, right around there, that they are other countries try to invade them. Much larger countries try to invade them, and they're unsuccessful in doing it. And not only that, but Ethiopia made a pact with Muslims, with Islamic nations, because they came to the aid of this Islamic nation to protect them in a time where they were being taken over, so that the Muslims don't even try to attack Ethiopia. Ethiopia seems to be a very magical place. So can you tell us a little bit about the countries that tried invading Ethiopia?
Yeah, it is definitely magical. And some of those churches that I mentioned, the Lalibela churches, they apparently were built in 1200 AD. And the local legends are that angels assisted in the building of these temples. And there's also a conspiracy out there that the Knights Templars built them. but the mainstream history is that the locals built them. But yeah, so one of the first people to try and invade Ethiopia was the Italians and Egyptians in the 1800s, and it was King Menelik II who fought them back very hard, and he used modern strategies of using guns. He used guns, which a lot of African rulers were opposed to. They were relied on archaic weapons or spirituality, but he understood the times, and he armed his men with guns. And so when the Egyptians and Italians came, they fired back hard and remained in their sovereignty. And it was King Menelik II in the 1800s, late 1800s, who started to really unify Ethiopia and strengthen it for what it would become, especially under his nephew, Haile Selassie, who is deified by the Rastafarians now. And he also had to face the Italians and face some temporary defeat, especially when he was basically betrayed and let down by the United League of Nations, when he kind of begged them for their help, but they kind of just turned a blind eye and let Mussolini, the fascist, kind of take over some of Ethiopia. But then when Mussolini started partnering with Hitler, and then World War II was starting to come about, or maybe World War I, sorry, was starting to come about. One of those, don't quote me on that. But when they noticed that they were starting to, take over, that's when England and those guys got involved. Like, okay, maybe we should all kind of partner up. And then they helped them. They gave them some forces, some troops, and then Haile Selassie was able to reclaim Ethiopia and then strengthen it. But what ended up being Ethiopia's downfall politically was actually its own people, its own domestic violence. Haile Selassie was eventually taken down by a coup by his own people, by young people who were kind of more privy to communist ideas and wanted to eradicate the monarchy. And so that was mostly their downfall, actually, was their own people.
That's very interesting. And
their own version of Antifa.
Yeah, from the inside, it's united we stand, divided we fall. That's how it goes with everyone everywhere. So a few little things that I wanted to hit on were, so Ethiopia, they were such practicing Jews that when they heard about Jesus, they said, "Oh, he fulfills the scriptures, the prophetic scriptures." So then they all really kind of just turned into a Christian nation. And the reason why that they kept the book of Enoch, they've had the book of Enoch in their canon, in their regular Bible the entire time that the book of Enoch has existed. Why they have had that in there is because the rest of the Christian nations, which would be Europe, kind of excluded Ethiopia from their different Council of Nicaea and different things, all these different councils that they were having going on. Ethiopia kind of became this forgotten nation, but kept practicing Christianity from its root source rather than adjusting the way Catholicism, which means universal, so universal Christianity kind of took over in the form under the name of Catholicism, took over, except for this area. It was preserved, and there's other prophetic, or not prophetic, there's other travelers who talked about mysterious lands that were Christian nations that were practicing Christianity in a different way than everybody else, slightly different. Have you come across that at all?
Yeah, so I go to the Book of Enoch a little bit in the book, and what's fascinating that I found was that it was highly regarded, prior to the Common Era and the Council of Nicaea. It was highly regarded by early Christians, and apparently it was like a go-to book for Paul. So Paul, he kind of quotes from it in certain ways, like the
Jesus
whole.
too.
Yeah, Jesus quotes directly from it, and there's a direct word for word quotation from it in I think it's Jude.
Mm-hmm.
in the book of Jude is a quote, word for word quote. So it was obviously highly regarded in ancient times. And what I like to say is, if Jesus was who he says he was, right, it would make sense that he would want to know and read this book coming from one of the most important patriarchs, Enoch, right? So he's an intellectual guy. Of course, he would know about the book. Of course, he would read about it. And it's a very important book because it gives us very detailed information about the fall of the angels and their interaction with mankind, and how a version of sin or some of sin was transferred over to us. And what was I going to say? Yeah, no, it's a very important book. And oh yeah, the early church started to kind of like transform the idea of angels, and they started to ban the book of Enoch and ban the idea of angels being corporeal or physical beings, to the point where it was even deemed a heretical ideology. And some of the early Christian philosophers who still stuck to that idea of fallen angels being corporeal or physical were deemed as heretics, and some of them possibly burned at the stake. So later the church got rid of that idea, got rid of the book of Enoch, and for whatever reason they didn't want us to think of that. They didn't want us to know the history of fallen angels and their actual involvement and interaction with us.
Right. Yeah, it's very interesting because the book of Enoch, the oral traditions go back 1,000 years before the flood, but Enoch isn't the one who wrote the book. So I think that's where it gets into who actually wrote it. But it actually was written at around the same time as Genesis, which was written by Moses. So while we don't know who scribed the book of Enoch, we know that the stories extend from the oral tradition from when Enoch was here, because he passed the information on to his his sons and grandsons. Was it Methuselah or Melchizedek? I always get the two of them confused. But he's the great grandfather of Noah, and Noah was the time of the flood, which brings up the question to me, and I do have some things that we'll get back into in a moment here about Ethiopia, but it brings up the question to me, did did Enoch, when he got raptured, was taken to heaven? So when we look into what was going on in heaven, you go to 3 Enoch. Have you ever come across 3 Enoch?
It's been a while since I've read it. It's been a while.
Okay. Yeah. So 3 Enoch is a rabbi who he had this mystical experience where he went to heaven and he saw Metatron, and he asked Metatron to show him who he was as a human, and he showed him Enoch. And in this 3 Enoch, he's describing heaven in a way that it's records on records, that he comes across 20 different characters named with their second name being Yahweh. It was always one name and then Yahweh. They were the gatekeepers, essentially, that they were the last person he had to get by in order to go to the next level. And so there were at least 20 of them that he writes in there. And it's just, everything is so repetitive in 3 Enoch, because he's saying the same thing on this level and then this level. So it really paints the image of records on records. So when Enoch is in heaven, when this rabbi is with Enoch in heaven, he sees Enoch, how he is, or Metatron, I'm going to say Enoch mostly, but he's Metatron now as we would know him. But so when he sees Enoch, he sees that he is like being worshipped by all these other beings. And when Enoch first came to heaven, all the angelic beings that were there were like turning their nose at this human Enoch, because they're like, why is he here? Like saying like God was wrong. Like, why'd you bring this guy here? He stinks like a human, they actually say. And then God, like, he does something and makes everybody bow down to Enoch. Everyone in heaven bows down to Enoch. And this rabbi sees this, and he's just like, oh my God, like this must be God. And God hears his thoughts saying this. So then he gets one of his highest up angels to give Enoch 60 lashings, just to say, no, he's not God. that if he was God, he wouldn't do that to himself. So it's a very strange thing, but I think that possibly, this is a very weird thought that I've had, but it kind of fits into how things would work, that Enoch gets raptured up, that all happens, but then he gets sent back down as Jesus Christ, that he's born as Yeshua, and then this is why he has all these magical abilities, why he's able to do everything at such a young age, because he was reincarnated from this one being who never died. So it's not a reincarnation, it's just a continuation of his spiritual understanding, that he was taken from heaven, taken from earth, because he was such a loyal servant to God, that God decided to arm him with all of the different things he would need for later on, so that he could then become God incarnate. Have you ever had the thought about that, or anything?
I've had similar thoughts. I mean, yeah, that's pretty. It's pretty interesting speculation, and the whole Metatron thing is wild too. Like in the Kabbalah, Metatron is highly regarded in the Kabbalah, and yeah, Enoch or Metatron is seen as, like, as they call it, a little god or a little Yahweh. It's like another
Right.
term that they use for him, and yeah, the whole idea of him being reincarnated as Jesus is wild, because one of Jesus's main missions, it seems, right, is like to cast demons out, and like to almost like come back and like get all these demons and fallen angel spirits, like, kind of like clean them up, almost like a Ghostbusters mission to come back and like finish the job. So that could make sense, because Enoch witnessed these angels, and so he's coming back now to finish the job and exercise them and get them and banish them to where they need to go, and save our souls. And so that could be there could be something there, definitely a connection. It gets deep, man, when you start viewing things metaphysically and start understanding consciousness, and how there is a bigger picture being played here, and stuff like that. So that's pretty wild.
Yeah, and I mean, when we look at the different quotes that are similar, I have a 3-part series on my YouTube channel about the Book of Enoch, and I break it down in a different way than just like straight chapters. I break it down into the fallen angel section, the Son of Man section. I kind of piece things together throughout the book, and I only use one Enoch, but I piece it together in a different way so that we can kind of understand it better. And I do a comparison of quotes from Enoch and Jesus, and my thoughts are that maybe they're not the same character. Maybe Jesus and Enoch aren't, Jesus isn't the continuation of Enoch, but they're at least getting their information from the same source, because they're saying the same things, just in slightly different wordings, which maybe they weren't different wordings. Maybe it's just translated to us in English as different now. Who knows if you go back into what the original language, whatever that language would have been that they were speaking, that maybe they were saying the same thing, but a lot of it could be that it is a continuation, and he's saying the same thing now, or 2000 years ago, where he was saying it from 4,000 years earlier or 3,000 years earlier. So it's weird. And Enoch is called like the youngin, essentially. When he's in heaven, he's called the youngest god. I forget. They're like poking fun at him for it. They're like calling him the littlest god, the youngest god. I forget exactly what the name that they call him, but yeah, they're like calling him youngin, basically. Like, hey, what up, youngin?
Yeah.
Because he's the youngest new god that was
What up,
created.
Jan? Yeah, and I don't know if you've come across this. It's something I've been meaning to study, but apparently there were 2 Enochs in the Bible.
Yeah.
There was Enoch of the Seth line, all right? And then there was an Enoch of the Cain line. And actually, Cain, there's a weird thing that the Bible states, and it's after Cain killed Abel, the mark was given to him, and then the Bible just says that he went off to go build a city, and that he was going to name it after his son, Enoch. So there's a city out there named by Cain as Enoch. But apparently there were 2 Enochs, and there's some studies on that, and it was the Enoch of the Cain line that the Freemasons worship or deify, and it was that Enoch that kind of like showed us some of the early showed us some of the early versions of magic and taught us magic and the dark arts and stuff like that.
Even reading and writing he brought to the people.
Yeah, so Enoch plays a huge role in Freemasonry.
Yeah, well, that's where I get into the imposter syndrome, that the Cain line, and it's not just Enoch, but there's other names in the two lines that line up, like Lamech, I think, is another one that is a name that's in both lines. I think it's like the 5th in Cain's, and I think it's like the 9th or 10th in Seth's. It's a very weird thing where, I mean, it is imposter syndrome, like we were talking about earlier, Ashtar and Ishtar. I mean, it's that was male and female, but they're still very similar names. It's, this imposter syndrome. I think we're not in a world of duality. We're in a world of
there's like doppelgangers.
Doppelgangers of imposters. That there's something here that shouldn't be here, which I think maybe that's why the book of Enoch was probably ultimately taken out of the Bible, because people got worried that they would attribute it to the wrong Enoch, so they just didn't want people looking into it. Which it could be that,
because then that brings you to the 2 different Johns, and
well, there's so many different Johns.
Well, right, but
there's even a conspiracy of 2 different Jesuses.
Yeah.
There's all kinds of weird clones going on.
Yeah, well, you have Jesus of Barbarous, right? Yeah, who was the murderer, and then you have Jesus of Nazareth. So
the Savior.
Yeah, and it's written in Greek by people who were Hebrew, and it's not translated as Yeshua or Joshua in the Greek. It's translated as Jesus, which we call Jesus. It's this whole weird thing that
big old puzzle.
Yeah,
like the sacred
big old crystal.
Yeah.
That book talks of Reagan and Regan, Backer and Baker. There's so many doubles
that is just so close.
Yeah.
Have you heard of the Toledet Yeshu?
No, I haven't.
This is an interesting thing, just to bring up for fun. Apparently, the Toledet Yeshu is known as the book of Yeshu, or the book of Jesus, kind of, right? But it was taught in the Jewish church early on, but it's since then been taken out because it's like a super like insulting and disrespectful version or take on Jesus's life. But they would teach it in the early Jewish church, and what it taught was that Jesus was actually a magician, and like a dark arts magician. And it's pretty weird what they say. They say that he snuck into one of the temples, and that he acquired the name of God through the temples, right? Which is sacred in the Jewish world, and you cannot pronounce it. So he acquired the name of God. He wrote it down on a piece of parchment, and then like slit his wrist, and then like slid the parchment into his arm, and then that's how he did all the miracles. So that's what they taught in the Toledet Yeshu. And among some other like just heinous things that they say about his mom and stuff.
Wow.
I wonder if that's what.
Well, yeah.
Gives me some things to think about.
I mean, you could see why Judaism they don't accept him.
Jesus as Savior.
But
right.
yeah. So, but anyway, I want to get back to Ethiopia before we wrap it up here, because there's a lot of interesting things, and talking about Jesus and how his birthday, as I'm sure you know, and many of my listeners know, probably isn't December 25th, but he could have been conceived on that day. That could have been the day of conception. It's a weird thing, but so when we get into the time and the calendar,
we both raised our eyebrows like, no. I saw him do it, and I did it at the same time.
What?
Like when you said he could have been conceived on that day, and I went, no, and I saw his eye go, no.
Well, why no? Why no?
Just what I felt and what I saw him feel at the same time. So just kind of.
It's okay, but if he's born in September, so I'm lining it up. Well, I'm lining it up for you. He was probably conceived that day. Okay. Yeah. So when we get into the way time works. Okay, can I get through this?
Yes.
When we get into how time works, we have the northern hemisphere and the southern hemisphere. We have winter and summer are, northern hemisphere, it's winter, and southern hemisphere will be summer. So there's 6 months separated. Ethiopia is in the southern hemisphere. We're in the northern hemisphere. So September 11th is Ethiopia's first day of the year. So it's September 11th to us, but so 12/25 to 9/11 would be 9 months. So that's why it could be the date of conception is December 25th, the day that God entered the earth realm. And that is, I mean, 12/25 was being celebrated by many different beings before that, but there's a reason why they picked that day as if they were gods. They were parading as if they were God. But so 9/11 to us is the fall. But where he was in the southern hemisphere, it would have been the spring, which makes sense that the spring is the first day of the year. And that's how it used to be celebrated. When we look at the names of our months, we have Septembre would be 7, October would be 8, but we consider that 9 and 10, and November and December, same thing. So everything kind of got twisted a bit for us to understand what was going on, and we got January 1st is the first day of the year for us, but that's celebrating Janus, the two-faced god of Rome. And there's so many different weird things, but Ethiopia considers 9/11 to be the first day of the year. And not just that, but they also believe that it's the year now, 2014, that 2020 for us was 2012 for them, which the Mayans predicted 2012 would be the end of the world. So it gets into this weird thing. They have 13 months where 12 of them are 30 days and the 13th month is 5 days, but I don't think that's how it was really kept for Enoch, because when we get into the book of Enoch, there are 360 numbered days, but then there are 4 days that are named, which we would call solstices and equinoxes. And then there's the day of the reckoning of the Lord, which that would be 365. That would be the new year. And what would that day be called? Sunday. And then every 4 years, there would be a moon day or a Monday, because the moon has 4 phases. So it only gets 1 day out of, it takes 4 years for it to get 1 day, whereas the sun gets a day of reckoning every year. So the moon gets a reckoning every 4 years. So that's how I really kind of put that together a little bit. I added in the moon day and Sunday based upon my understandings of things. But
Yeah.
Ethiopia, the way they keep track of time is very different from the rest of the world. And have you come across how their calendar and the possibility that 2020 was actually the year 2012?
I have not gone into their calendar. That was fascinating, by the way you put that together. I could see now how it could have been, how it could have been conceived in December. Yeah. No, I mean, yeah, you're good with the math stuff. I remember that on the other podcast. That stuff's cool.
It's so weird that it's 2014 in Ethiopia. That's got to be. I'm just like thinking of flight schedules and things like that's got to screw up so many things.
Yeah, let me go over there. 2014 was a cool year. I'm gonna go
I want to go back to 2014.
I was a drug addict in 2014, so I'm cool.
Man.
Wow.
No, yeah, I mean, yeah. No, dude, all that stuff is fascinating, and we have to sometimes look at it into that much detail, right? Like metaphysically speaking, if we're in a metaphysical world, we're up against the sigil magic, right? We're up against they play games, right? The dark arts or the elite or whatever, or even the spiritual world or the Bible is very specific about symbols and numbers and all that. So if we aren't paying attention to actual numbers and symbols like the way you do, then we're just kind of like just being led along to the timeline or the narrative that they want to tell us. But that was fascinating, and we should be paying attention to detail.
Yeah, the main reason I shook my head no is because I'm thinking September is not spring, because I know that spring would
Southern
be
Hemisphere.
when I think Jesus was born.
Right. Well,
so
that's when
you twisted that.
Yeah,
to
it's the
make
southern
spring be
hemisphere.
in September, that made sense.
Right. So when you look at the Hebrew scholars, they say that Nisan 14, which is when Jesus was born, had to be March because that's when they would have the the shepherds would be in the field waiting on the births of all the different animals. Excuse me. But we're looking at it from a northern hemisphere perspective rather than the southern hemisphere. So that's where
Interesting.
you have to transplant yourself to the different areas and why it would be the way it would be. So we can't just be in America and be like, oh yeah, it was March. It was sometime in March, but they were on the southern hemisphere, so it would have been sometime in September. And
Yeah.
and September 11th, Ethiopia, being this Christian nation, being a Hebrew nation first, then a Christian nation, and being kept whole, nobody was ever able to pierce it for whatever reason. I mean, at times, like you said, they went to
Had some
war, and
invasions.
they they had issues within themselves were the biggest problem, but they, for the most part, they've stayed whole, and they've kept things from outside perspective, where everyone else is running around with the Catholicism, the universal Christianity, and they're keeping it the same. And same with Judaism before Christianity. They kept it very close to the chest. They have all these different specific things that other countries and time periods don't. I think Ethiopia is greatly important on a scale that we can't imagine, really, that we don't really know what it is.
Right.
But there's something about Ethiopia that is very, very important, and I think maybe we got to keep our eyes on what's going on down there, because even with, as I said earlier, the Eritrean Defense Forces, when they slaughtered that 800 to 1,000 different monks, it wasn't reported on until almost a year later. I think it happened in 2019, and it wasn't reported on until 2020. This terroristic group did this right before the pandemic hit. I mean, that can't just be coincidence, or right at the same time anyway.
So hard to study a place whose timeline is so off from your own. That's
Yeah, the years.
Must be
Yeah.
difficult.
Yeah, no, definitely. Yeah, it fascinates me, and every now and then I'll just like pop up on Google, just news, and just type in Ethiopia just to kind of see what's going on over there. Because yeah, we're definitely neglected, but it's actually a pretty advanced country, like socioeconomically, and it's just always going through some like domestic turmoil. But behind all that is just this fascinating history that we just went over. So it's definitely something we should keep our eye on. And to kind of just go back to the Jesus being born thing, just my last thoughts on that is everything's just interconnected, right? Like we live on one world, one people, one God. So all of history is just one history. And what's interesting is there's always little symbolisms in the stories, right? And so in the story of Jesus being born, you have the star and the three wise men, and people kind of overlook that too, because but the wise men were known as magi in the Bible. And the magi, that's actually the name of the Zoroastrian priest. And so what's interesting is if you study Zoroastrianism and Zoroaster, what he did was he came to eradicate the old world of polytheism and teach about the one God, Ahura Mazda. And Zoroastrianism has precedence in a lot of Judaic thought and philosophy and Christian ideas. And so it's interesting how it was the Magi, the Zoroastrian priests, who taught about a future savior. This is one of the tenets of Zoroastrianism, is a Messiah. So it's interesting that these Magi played such an important role of following the star to come see this new king, this new savior that was being born. So everything's interconnected. It's one people, one world, one God. Ethiopia has a very important role in all of this. Enoch has a very important role in all of this. And even we do today. The Bible is still being, like I like to say, there are new chapters that are being written that might be, concreted and told in some future.
Wow, that's greatly interesting. And I'll leave you with this thought. Well, have you listened to my episode 83, Larry Paul?
Not yet.
Oh, okay. You'll really like that one. It's called The Great Pyramid of Christianity, and he presents a case to where, and it's not his original idea, but he has found some evidence to support this, his own original evidence, by going over to the pyramids. And he talks about how the pyramid was probably built by Enoch, or carried on maybe when Enoch passed on, that it was Methuselah that created it, and Noah that did this, and that the only thing that was ever found in the pyramids was an empty tomb that would signify the empty tomb of Jesus, and that the name of Yahweh is written on the actual entrance, but that entryway is closed off to the public, and they created a new entryway so you don't see that name. It's a very weird thing, but I think you would really like that episode. And my final thought is that Yahweh, when we look at the YHWH, or I mean, I'm sorry, YWHW for Yahweh, I think that we don't, like I said earlier, we don't know how they were pronouncing things because we're only given the consonants. The vowels weren't written down. I think God's name in English would be AEIOU, and if you're to spell it YAEH, W, what hell is it? It's Yahuwah, or Yahuwah would be how it would be pronounced. You get the W and the H in there at the end somewhere, and then we look at different countries that had gods or lords called Yahuwah, and you have the Native Americans and the Chinese had it around the same time. They had different lords or gods named that. So when we start to look at it and piece it together, like you said, it's a one people, it's a one history, and things have just been perverted and twisted and taken from this area and put in this area, and so on and so forth. But when you look at things that have been untouched, like Ethiopia, it really brings it all together for us.
Absolutely.
Do you want to let the people know where they can find you and where they can buy your book?
Absolutely. So you can find me on Instagram at Esoteric Eddie. I post some content on there that you won't find on my YouTube, which is Esoteric Eddie TV. And on there, I got videos and documentaries, trying to put something out every couple weeks. I already got some stuff backlogged that I'm going to be putting out. Some interesting stuff on there. And I just started a Twitter. I'm not going to be very active on there, but if you want to, it's esoteric_Eddie. And the book is The Lucifer Mystery Revealed, under my author name, which is Eduardo Fidencio Cano.
All right. So I will definitely have all those links in the description, including the YouTube channel, I said that earlier, Esoteric Eddie TV. I will include all of that. And the final thing that I like to ask all of my guests is, what is your go-to grounding technique? In this world of perversion and inversion, how do you keep yourself grounded to the truth?
Wow, fascinating.
Sounds like
question.
The dog.
Yeah, no worries. Yeah, I just tell myself, well, sometimes I meditate. I'll meditate a little bit, but I don't know. I've always held a personal connection to the Creator, and I keep myself neutral. I'm not a radical this or a radical that. I've just always been very neutral and Zen. And I've always kind of just looked at the world through the lens of an observer, not somebody who has to involve themselves with the craziness. So I keep a Zen mind state by being neutral and connected to the source, and knowing that things are unfolding just as they should. And I should only worry about the things that I can change and focus on those things.
Yeah, sorry about the dogs barking, but that was a beautiful way to put it, because that's really what I try to get my listeners to do, is focus on yourself, change what you can within yourself. When you see something outside of yourself that you inherently know is evil, you participate and stop it. But that we take care of ourselves, clean ourselves out, and ground ourselves to the truth of our one Creator, because we all come from one source.
I like what you said about staying neutral. It's sometimes it's difficult to not try to force our knowledge or our opinion on someone else. But when you do that, it's really not helping anything.
Absolutely.
Yeah, we like to keep things as all possibility around here.
Yes.
And until we find information that makes something false or verifiably false, we like to keep the possibility of everything, because we can't really know until we know that something's false.
Almost. It's almost like some of the things that we both study together, we will have different viewpoints, and that may be forever, or that may be until one of us has an experience that changes our opinion.
Right.
Absolutely. No, it's beautiful.
All right. Well, we'll say goodbye to our audience. Goodbye, everybody. We will talk to you later.